and welcome to SEAA-Sons. SEAA-Sons stands for Southeast Asian American Sons. This is the show for exploring the experiences of Southeast Asian Americans through the lens of two Southeast Asian American sons. Hello, my name is Jason, or JN. I'd like to introduce you to my co-host. He is...
Hello everyone, my name is Yang Lor.
Hey Yang, welcome back. It is the year 2025, and in China we also just celebrated Chunjie. So Chunjie is the Chinese saying for Spring Festival, which actually just means Happy New Year or New Year. So both New Years have been celebrated here. How did you celebrate yours?
So it was Lunar New Year, right?
It's two things. It's either Chinese New Year or it's Spring Festival. Spring Festival is kind of uncommon in the West. I never heard that growing up. I always heard Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year. Having learned Chinese and being out here, that is how people say New Year's out here. And then UNESCO, since last year, just recognized Chinese New Year or Spring Festival, using those two terms as the actual recognition of the New Year. But in the US or in the West, they call it Lunar New Year. My understanding is because it's more inclusive. Other cultures celebrate it in addition to Chinese. But then there's different dialogues now about that, because people say, well, if it's not about who celebrates it, it's about where it's from, like who started it, like where did this originate. So it does originate in China because it's according to the agricultural calendar, and it's a lunar solar calendar opposed to just a lunar calendar. So it's a little bit inaccurate to say just lunar, even though we know what it means. So it's kind of about accuracy. The other is about the origin. So there's different ways to think about it, but I think depending on who you talk to is what you'll say.
Thank you for the history lesson. It's different perspective. And so for me, my New Year's was a month ago. So we are actually, today we're recording in February. And so during New Year's, I was actually in Bangkok. I went there I was in Thailand for 2 weeks for vacation. And so it was a very welcome break for me. I feel like there's nothing like going to a different country, a different culture. It really changes how you see the world. A lot of times we travel within the same country, and so we see new things, we do new things, we eat new food, but we still have the same mindset. And if you go to a different country, you gotta really think about life in a different manner. And so I appreciated that, and I come back to the US with more gratitude, but also just I feel like there's more meaning and more motivation in life. All right, so our topic today is on identity, and I teach sociology, and so I teach a class on introduction to sociology, and one of the weeks is about identity. And so typically people have their own understanding of what identity is, and so when you take a college course, the professor wants to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And so I typically supply my students with a working definition for us to understand what are we talking about when we say identity? Because some of us in society, we don't have to think about it, because we just feel like society revolves around us. We don't have to think about who we are. And then for other people, identity is very important, because wherever they go, they feel visible. They feel like they're targeted. And so to them, who they are is very visible to them. And other people, identity doesn't seem to matter that much. Okay. So what is identity? So identity refers to distinctive characteristics. So these are things that make you unique. So distinctive characteristics of a person that relate to who they are. Okay. So, specific things about who you are, or what is meaningful to you, or what is meaningful to them. Okay, so there's two aspects, who you are, but also what is it that you find that is valuable or important to you, who you are as a person. And so that's how we define identity. And so today we're going to be talking about, what is important to us when we explain ourselves to other people. And so when others ask you, who are you? What are you most likely to bring up? And typically your answers to these questions reflect what we call your identity, things that you find valuable to who you are as a person. Okay. All right, so Jason, you want to start us off? Who are you, and what's important to you?
Let's see. I think the way to answer this question for me, it's always that question that you always get that seems controversial, is the one about where you're from, who you are. So where you're from is a question that a lot of people might find controversial in the US just because it seems to imply that you are an other. And I get that. But I do get that question as well out here in China. And I think about it differently here in the sense that a lot of times people will ask that because in China, it's quite homogenous. Not only is it mostly Chinese, but mostly Han-Chinese. So you stand out if you are different or look different. You definitely stand out more if you're white or black. But if you're also Asian, then that's very unclear about who you are. So for me, I think it's just a way of clarifying if someone asks. I don't go around just telling people I'm American or Cambodian, but if people ask, then I do think it's an opportunity actually to share a little bit about me, because I think being here, it kind of allows me to do that, but also it shouldn't be unexpected that you would get that. I'll say I'm from the US, California, and my family is from Cambodia. So I think for them, that helps them understand why I look the way I do, but also why I speak English instead of like, let's say Chinese, or speaking a different dialect they may expect from the region. The guess people make about where I'm from are typically a Southeast Asian country. So typically I would get Malaysian or Philippines. So I think that it's just by proximity of Asia or China in these regions. Whereas I think I would also get these guesses in the US as well. But typically, I think that's more about in comparison. It's like, oh, I don't actually know what you are, but you look like this Filipino person I've met. So it's a bit of an interesting way of interacting with people in different areas. And it's also interesting when I get this question in the US, because if I do say I'm Cambodian, I'll get a couple kind of responses. One, they'll just try to relate it to something they know. They'll be like, oh, I met this guy, he's Cambodian. Or it's like, oh, have you seen that documentary? And then for me, that's kind of like a joke, because documentaries about Cambodian are always about the genocide or about the refugee experience. And I think that's an important topic, but I feel like always being compared to that, it's just kind of very limiting. It's just like, oh, this is all I really know about you. So, I'm not blaming them. I just feel like as far as visibility or our stories being told, it's just not very broad or dynamic at this point. So hopefully me as a storyteller and other Cambodian Americans out there being more visible and active, it actually creates more presence about that. So in general, my idea of identity is different here than it is in the US. But I think for me, what's most important is just what I know. I think it's all about knowledge for me. I think it's a little too basic just to say I'm either this or that, or I'm just based on what my blood is. So I do like the fact that identity is something you can form yourself. And then if someone gives you the opportunity, you can share them based on what you know or how you understand it. And I think right now it's all just about my background, first of all, but then what I know about the world, and then I would inform it in that way. That may not make a lot of sense. It seems a little abstract, but I think what it means that it's just I just see everything as historical context, in that people understand things based on what they know. So for me, the more I know, then the more I can maybe fill in gaps that they don't have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You bring up a lot of points about how identity is complex, so it's fluid, and there's a lot of choices. We have a lot of choices. You talked about how in China, when people ask you that question, who are you? You bring up different parts of your identity. In America, when people ask you that question, you bring up other parts of your identity. And that just reminds me, when I was in Thailand, people often assume I was either Filipino or I was Vietnamese. And that's because most of the Asian tourists to that country are from the Philippines or from Vietnam. And so how people understand us is very dependent upon the context. If they haven't seen people of Hmong descent in that area, they're not gonna even think I'm Hmong at all. They may never have heard about it. All they know about is if you are Asian and short, then you must be Vietnamese or Filipino. If you're tall and light skinned, you must be, let's say, Korean or somewhere else. Okay, and so context matters so much to how people how people perceive and how they categorize us, but context also affects what identity we choose to bring up when we are asked to describe ourselves. For instance, in my classes I teach, I recognize that people see me as Asian Americans already, so I don't have to tell them I'm Asian American. And so when I tell my students who I am, I bring up these identities that's relatable to my students. So I bring up the fact that I'm low income. So I grew up in poverty. I bring up the fact that I am a first generation college student. So that's someone whose parents did not attend or complete college. And then I bring up the fact that I am Hmong American, because I think people see me as Asian American, and so they might assume, I am, one of those Asian, because there's the stereotype that Asian Americans are, they are from, well-to-do background. And so I wanted to find ways to connect with my students, so I emphasized those aspects of my identity. And so, I think these point to important aspects of our identity. They are fluid. They are based on the specific context in which we're interacting with people. We do have choices, so it's not like, who we are is who we are, but what we choose to present ourselves as can be different from place to place, Yeah,
that's a really good point. I do want to emphasize that what you bring up can be infinite, but what you do actually bring up does depend on who you're talking to. So I think it depends on what questions you ask, where you're at, and things like that. So we could definitely go on and on about who we are and what it is we identify with, but at the end of the day, I guess as long as you know what you are, then that's really what matters.
Part of it is what we are aware of and what we project. And so when people ask you that direct question, who are you? You are put in a position where you have to select those identities that you want to present to the people asking that question. Other times, identity can be visible through kind of what we do and what we talk about. This happened to me recently, where a faculty said that, they appreciate the fact that I bring my whole self to my classroom because I don't shy away from being a father. I bring that up quite a bit in my classroom. And I never thought about that as an identity. Of course, I use my experiences as a father, my parenting experiences to give examples with some of the things we talk about. And so, for instance, we talk about how important it is to have diversity in the media. Like my kids, when they, it's a totally different impression when they see someone who looks like them. Like Shang-Chi is one of those Marvel movies where my son sees someone that looks like him, and it's so impressionable. And so these are kind of instances when I bring my kids into my lecture. And I never thought about that as being part of my identity. It's just something I do. But for other people, it's like, wow, he's comfortable bringing him his identity as a father. Just so that we are aware, some things you are consciously trying to put out there. Other things, it's who you are and you just do it, but you don't think about it until other people bring it up to you.
That's true. But I guess same question to you then. How do you feel you identify? Has it changed?
I would say it hasn't changed as much. I would say, as I think about my upbringing, when I was growing up, I think the most important thing to me was being like Hmong American. Like that's a big part of my identity, like the Hmong community. We interact quite often. We have a lot of family events. And so I knew that I was Hmong. The other part about being poor is sometimes when you are surrounded by people who are like you, that identity is not very visible. So let's say, for instance, I grew up in a low-income area. Everyone else was poor. So I didn't know I was poor until I got to college. And then I'm like, wow, there are people who have much more resources than me. And so sometimes some aspects of who we are is not visible at a particular point until we interact with people who are different from us. And so when I got to college, I knew my identity as Hmong American, and I was not very fond of being Asian American because I had this stereotype that Asian Americans they didn't represent who I was. These are like, rich families, and they had interests, or they didn't care much about their kind of ethnic roots or their history. And then I started learning about the Asian American movement and about Asian Americans, fighting for their rights, fighting for representation. And through college, I came to embrace this identity of Asian American. So, let's say maybe when I was younger, if there's anything about Asian American, I just brushed it off. Like it doesn't hurt me. I'm not that. I'm actually Hmong American. But then in college, because I embraced the identity, I feel like a sense of obligation to really stand up to things that are targeted towards Asian Americans, even though it might be targeted towards, let's say, Chinese or Japanese or Koreans. I feel like, people also saw me as Asian American as well. And so I should also stand up for my rights and my representation as well.
You could say with age comes maturity. And I think that is a matter of how you develop yourself and what you feel comfortable with. Before, I think it was more comfortable just accepting the broad term of Asian, not so much the Cambodian label, just because it wasn't that visible. So it's just like, okay, at least the broader label allows me more space to navigate. Whereas the specific label, ethnic label, was a little less. Because in one sense, you're a minority in a minority. So you kind of are a little more isolated now. So, but now I don't feel that kind of pressure as I might have then, especially in youth, because you're still kind of navigating spaces. But now that I'm more comfortable in my skin and having different kind of experiences, I don't necessarily have to feel like I need a safety label like that as much. But I do think it's still something that's a part of me. I do feel like these kind of topics are a little bit limiting to a degree when you do feel like you need to present it. But at the same time, it actually is an important part of a conversation because it's something that's a part of you. Just talking about your childhood, it already kind of brings up your cultural background. So you don't necessarily have to bring it up, but at the same time, it does get brought up. So hopefully, though, that's just a way of sharing more information. So I didn't know I was different when I was younger. I just felt like you, I was just living a normal life the way everyone else just lives, based on, household family in a place where I was. So it wasn't until I went to school I felt that I was different, mainly because you get questions like, where you're from or what's your background. And then I never really thought about that because, you never get that question in your neighborhood or people like you. So suddenly when you're interacting with other groups, you get that othering. So by being compared to others, suddenly you feel like you are an other. And in some cases, you might feel like that means something. Yeah, it might mean less because representation on screen or in the dominant culture is a little bit more of a certain group opposed to another group. So you might seem like, oh, well, because they're bringing it up, it must mean something. And then when you're younger, it might mean something inferior. So I think growing up with that kind of experience does lead to this identity in college where we're like, okay, we need to find something to articulate what this means.
Like we both grew up like ethnically. You grew up Cambodian, I grew up Hmong. It's just part of how we lived our life. We talked about how we kind of embrace Asian Americans through college. Sometimes there's these identities, they're stereotype. When you think about being Asian, people stereotype you as Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee, and that's seen as something derogatory. And so some people want to distance themselves from those identities because that's how they understand the identity. And then as you undergo this process of learning, you recognize that being Asian is more than just Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee. Being Asian is really about Asian Americans contributed to the building of this country with the Transcontinental Railroad, with so many things that happened in California. Asian Americans formed the backbone of it, and so we're not foreigners. We're actually a key part of the building of California history. We stand up for our rights. Of course, we don't learn about this in the history books, but we play a pivotal role. And so when you learn about these things, it helps you to reclaim the identity that you sought to distance yourself from. But let's talk about being Southeast Asian. Like when did the identity become a part of who you are? Because this whole podcast is about being Southeast Asian American. And so far, we've not talked about that yet. So when did you come to identify as Southeast Asian American? American, and what experiences was pivotal to that identity?
I think very specifically, I forgot what grade. It must have been like fourth grade or something. But a lot of my peers were Viet. So most of them would have already had some kind of experience with each other in the sense of like different interactions. But Viets, or I guess maybe as kids in general, we always just kind of pick on each other for what we are. So that's when I really kind of just understood what I was in context to others. So I wasn't white like American classmates, and I wasn't Viet like Chinese looking. And there were other groups too. So there were a couple Hmong folks too, and then or Mexican. So with a hodgepodge or a group setting like that, just by difference, you have to kind of figure out what you are, because you kind of have to figure out where you belong. Because there weren't a lot of Cambodians, and most of the Asians kind of just grouped ourselves together. So, but the thing about when you group yourself together, you still get like that interaction where it's just we play off each other's differences. It was mostly playful, but I do think the subconscious or unconscious reaction to that is just you have to defend yourself against any kind of, like, let's say, verbal attacks or like being made fun of in one way or another. But also you have to come back with another thing. So it's like, that upmanship or that playing the nines, just being able to always have something to say to the other person. So I think that was a really big part of it. But I think also the traditions I grew up with were different than others. So I think a lot of the peers were either Western denominated religions, whereas Cambodians, they're mostly Buddhists, and then most of the people in that temple that we went to were Cambodian. So there was always that understanding of what we were, but having to share that with others, that's when, having to articulate it and things like that, that's when I guess that idea of Cambodianness comes about whenever you get a question about it or whenever you're explaining something about it. So I guess that's a good opportunity, but at the same time, it does form your identity in that way. So I think that's how that worked. And then I think throughout life, it was something similar, but just more developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it seems like the Southeast Asian identity to you was like very a social identity then. Like it's like just by hanging out with people of different ethnicity from Southeast Asia, you kind of get a sense of that identity. For me, it's like I went to a school where it was like mostly Hmong, and then the other groups were much smaller, and so there was not a lot of a cross-ethnic peer group, and so most of my friends were Hmong, and I had maybe one or two Lao friends, but that's about it. And so being Hmong was a very strong identity. And when I came to learn about Southeast Asian, it was more of a political identity. And so after I finished high school, I went to a summer program at UC Berkeley. It's the Southeast Asian Student Coalition Summer Institute. And so they bring in high school students from across California and sometimes even outside of California to learn more about Southeast Asian American identity, history, and culture, because we're all bounded by the experiences of the Vietnam War. We were all affected by that. We went through refugee resettlement. And so we learned so much about just being Southeast Asian American, the history of how U.S. colonization affected us and how we were kind of dispersed in this country. And so you learn about being Southeast Asian from a very kind of political perspective, about the importance of, really standing up for yourself, but also being critical of U.S. policies that force so many groups to be displaced from their homeland. And so the U.S. is deeply involved in why we are here in this country, and that the U.S. is also partly responsible for some of the issues that we deal with poverty, gang violence, because they place us in some of the poorest area. And so that's how I came to identify as Southeast Asian, but from a very kind of political perspective, like a political identity. And this is an identity for us to organize around.
That's a formidable way to think about it, because I think for a lot of people, they have to just figure it out as they go. But having a curriculum or at least a structure, I think it actually is a good thing, because it allows people to finally make sense of it. Because I think if you have no guidance or real direction, then it's kind of seems like you'll fall into the pit holes of just conforming or feeling like you're an outsider all the time. So nowadays, I don't know if it's the same. Hopefully not. Mainly in that if you're young and you're dealing with these kind of questions, that there's enough resources available that people can actually start to have a discourse, so that way they learn more about it in a structured way, or in a way that at least provides useful information instead of just grasping at straws.
Yeah, because I can imagine when you're adolescents and teenagers, you might have cross-ethnic friendship, but I don't think people are really trying to learn about each other. They're just like teasing each other about their using stereotypes to kind of tease each other. It's like a friendship, but that's how they join in. It's like they're able to tease each other. And so I think the friendship is kind of superficial on that level in terms of how much you know about each other's background, versus if you learn it from a specific curriculum or there's a structure around learn about each group and their history and their culture and their experiences.
Yeah, and I think one point to go back to is that you mentioned our Asian American history, and I think that is something to elaborate on, because there is the history of, let's say, the different groups. So I think that's the idea of Asian American history in general, is that it's not static, because it first starts with the first group that most people were aware of, the Chinese, and then after that there were other groups too, bringing up as agriculturists, and then the other groups too, in addition to brain drain and also refugees. So I think that's what we identify as, is that we recognize the timeline of Asian American development here, but also we're included too now in the latter part. But there is a bigger identity out there, but also there's other parts of it that are not as visible.
Yeah, so far we talked about how we came to embrace some of these identities that we didn't actually grow up with. So both of us are, you're Cambodian, I'm Hmong. We grew up with that way of life, that culture. So it was easy for us to identify as Cambodian or Hmong. We talked about being Asian American, how that came about, and also Southeast Asian American. So my question to you now is, our podcast is based on being Southeast Asian American. Why is identity important? Recently, there's been a lot of pushback against identity, like policies against DEI. I heard recently that people were being fired or being put on leave because they attended some sort of affinity group for, let's say, a racial group here. And so my question to you is, why are these things important?
Why is it important? I don't know why it's important, actually, but I do feel you'll have one if you like it or not. So it's better that you develop it in a way that you find useful. So I think it's important, just to put it out there. I think it's important because it allows you to understand your place in the world. It's kind of broad because you could do that in many ways, but I think the way you grow up and the things you encounter, the people you meet, they all inform your reality. So the better you understand, so in one sense, that's all external. So you understand the world based on your navigation through it. But what is it that you're developing in yourself that allows you to feel like maybe you belong or you have something to say? Maybe social media these days help you articulate it, because you can, a lot of people just record themselves opinionating and things like that. So it's almost the same as opinions. Like, even if you don't really think about something, you might have an opinion on it. And I guess in the more psychological sense, you'll have your ego that allows you to present yourself. So in psychology, you're presenting yourself. In philosophy, there's this idea of the self and how you learn. So I guess the basic idea behind identity is just understanding who you are, what it is you want to say about yourself, if you need to present yourself, opposed to someone labeling you and pigeonholing you and deciding for you. So I think that's why it's important. So at least you have a say in what it is you are and how you want to do things.
Yeah, I will give you an A. I will give you A if you're in my class, because we do have an essay about identity, and so.
Right.
I mean,
Yes.
you hit the nail on the point about just identity. Identity gives us kind of a purpose. It tells us who we are. You know, can you imagine if we don't have an identity? Let's say I just see myself as a young man, and I'm a father, but I don't recognize that I'm a father, and so I don't act and perform the expectations required of me. And so I think you're perfect that identity gives us a sense of who we are in this world, and that's important because it tells us like what are the expectations, what are we supposed to do in this particular space. And I also like the fact that you mentioned how identity gives us some control over who we are. Otherwise, if you're letting other people tell you who you are, then it's difficult to be able to figure out what you want to do in the future, especially in this country where there's so many choices. If you don't understand yourself, then it's going to be hard to figure out what is it that you want to become. What is it that brings you joy? And that reminds me of this quote, no history, no self. And so, if you don't know where you're from, like how do you know where you're actually going? What do you know what your purpose is? Because I think a lot of people's purposes are often based off of what they've experienced, based off of their identity. And so if you don't understand these things, then you just feel like you're just floating around. You just feel like I'm just going through life and I'm not exactly sure who I am or what I want to become. And I think identity, when we discuss it, the reason we talk about it being Southeast Asian is there's something in common that we have. And we feel that other people are going through similar experiences as well. And maybe they just don't have the vocabulary or they don't have the space to talk about these issues. And that's why we're here, is because we feel there's a group of people out there who have similar experiences, and our job is to share our experiences in the hopes that it can also help them navigate some of these transitions or challenges or opportunities in their lives as well.
Yeah, that's really important, because I think a lot of times if people are just having to figure it out, then you can get lost. And not only you get lost, but you could be off on the wrong track. So you'll get these kind of anomalies, let's say, people that seem contradictory. They look a certain way, they'll say certain things, and you're just like, and once that can build your empathy, you're like, oh man, that's unfortunate because they really fell off the rails. Or you're like, okay, that's how they think. There's a lot of different kind of ways people go about this.
Even for the groups that don't think identity is important, that's partly because society is revolving around their experience. So let's say when white people say race doesn't matter, and then we have our very first black president, and now they're questioning whether he is from this country, then race matters to them as well, because now it's a black person and they're finding it problematic. And so they have an identity crisis about, should a black person be a president of this country when we think about Americans as white? And so, so you want to expand just upon how identity can be weaponized by people to serve kind of their own political purposes here. So there is a danger to it as well.
So in the US, there's the idea of the melting pot. Wherever you're from, you all become American. And that's a problematic idea, because it's like you don't have a say based on what you are. You just have to become something, and then you become accepted. So that was a problematic framework. The other framework that I actually like better is the Canadian model, which is the mosaic. So regardless of where you are, you're part of this bigger picture. So we all have differences in many ways, even like, let's say, within the bigger group. So let's say white America is made up of other groups too. So part of it's class, part of it's gender, but the other of it is their own background. So we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, which is more of an Irish holiday. And then there's also even months. We have like Asian American Heritage Month. Right now it's February, so it's Black History Month. So it's being brought up in one way or another. So in one sense, we're celebrating it, saying that, no, we're embracing differences. That's how we're gonna include people. But then at the same time, you get these things that are a little bit more policy driven. And then I think anything that's policy driven will create an automatic resistance, because now you're saying, oh no, it's a policy, it's a mandate. You have to recognize these things. And I don't think that's how culture works. Culture is not about policies. It's not about bills and laws. It's more about people interacting and then understanding and being able to acknowledge and recognize. So it should be more on a cultural level, not a policy level. But I understand the policy level, because sometimes if you don't take initiatives, then the worst can happen. So let's say with segregation and things like that, or desegregation. So the fact that it even started with segregation was already problematic, but then creating desegregation, it already created a problem, and it made the problem worse, because now when you have desegregation, people are saying, well, my livelihood and things like that. But the first problem was segregating in the first place. So, but then it's just because there were groups of people that advocated for things like that wanted it. So you really create these problems and you don't create solutions, and it's all man-made. So I think that's the problem with it all.
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the point about how should we bring about positive social change. We recognize that this nation has a history of racism. How do we deal with it? Is it at the policy level or the cultural level? Unfortunately, when it comes to cultural changes, it takes a long time. The civil rights movement was really about that. They recognized that many years after slavery was abolished, black people were still seen as second-class citizen, still forced to sit at the end of the bus. And white people just couldn't see black people as equal. In such a situation, policy is kind of the intermediate. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all solution. Unfortunately, policy has to be implemented to force people to abide by certain ways of behaving. And so I think that's kind of how I see it. I see it differently. I get that, yes, everything should just be more, it should be cultural change. People should just act or behave in ways that support our values. But the part of the issue is just that, it requires so much change in our society for people to still see each other as equal. And so sometimes it's necessary to implement policy to force the kind of change we want to see. Otherwise, we might be waiting several generations. I mean, that's the whole point about the civil rights movement, was to bring people together, end segregation. And we still have a long ways to go. But I think at the very least, we understand that there is a role for policy, but policy cannot just be it. Ideally, we want people to be able to change their mind, change their behaviors in ways that support a diverse policy.
Yeah, and I think that's why we would have more dialogue in different ways. So with the initiative of, let's say, affirmative action and more inclusion, I think that is methods to allow for more awareness. But I think the problem that people have against these things are just that they feel like they're being victimized, or that they're starting to be forced. So I think that's what it is. Anything that seems forced, it always seems like there shouldn't be a role for that, where others are determining what you should think. So I don't know if it's a unique problem to the America or to dominant groups that are not interacting with other groups and things like that. So I just feel like that's something we haven't overcome yet. And I'm not sure really what the right answer is. I think there is a role for policy, like you said, because if we institutionalize biases or bigotry, then it doesn't allow other groups to really move. But if we create these policies that also allow for let's say advancement over others, I think this is when other people form these opinions. But I think this is where it gets weaponized, because people have these feelings, policy or not, but then other politicians or people that want to take advantage of these kind of tensions, they gravitate towards ideas that cater to these people. I think these people might be a voting bloc or something like that. So that's why I don't know if you really get authentic, sincere people that advocate for rights. They're more about, how do I gain power? I'll just leverage this one thing or another based on how people are perceiving these things. So yeah, ideally it would be more of a natural occurrence. But I think, yeah, overall, that's how we are kind of in the state we're in, or you're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think, we are undergoing a lot of an identity crisis in America. For the past maybe prior to, maybe prior to 2016, I mean, people seem to think that we were beyond a certain sort of a post-racial society. And then since 2016, we're beginning to see a lot of people say things that we traditionally consider to be racist, that is actually welcomed by people at the highest level. And so everything comes down to this topic of identity. Who do we want to be? And it seems like there's a lot of confusion. Part of it is that these conversations are meant to help groups bridge understanding, but that these things are happening to enable people in power to stay in power. And so that's where the issue becomes, is that anytime identity gets politicized, usually when it gets politicized for the purposes by the majority group, is really about oppression. Okay. And so I think we also want to be careful about thinking about identity being weaponized, because part of what we see in this society is that minorities often don't see themselves in ways that bring about solidarity. And so that's why there's a lot of political organizing to help minorities see that they share similar things and that they should fight for more inclusionary policies. Whereas when we see identity from the majority group, it's really about, well, this country is doing poorly because of these people of color. It's because of immigrants. They're stealing your jobs. And so, it's used, it's politicized differently. And I think we don't want to say blanketly that identity being politicized is a bad thing, because it can be used for purposes to bring our country together. But we also see instances in which it's being weaponized by the dominant group. Here I'm talking about white supremacists, to really target people of color. And so just want to be mindful of that. But that's the whole reason why we have this podcast, this specific episode on identity, helping folks understand some of the different debates that are occurring.
Yeah, and it's a really broad topic. We can keep bringing it up and discussing it in different episodes as well. And I think ultimately any kind of perspective we present will kind of tell you a little bit about who we are and what we know. So it's continually developing. I don't know if it's ever fixed. Yeah,
and it's good to have disagreements too. But I think the good part is that when you build a sense of trust, a sense of community, disagreements can actually help to strengthen the group. But when you come from different communities and you don't have that bond already, and you bring something sensitive like this up, then it has the potential to really bring about a lot of instability. And so the relationship you have amongst people is so crucial to any type of disagreement you have. If you have weak bonds, then of course, if you bring in something sensitive, then it's going to break down that specific group. And so anytime a sensitive topic is brought up, we want to make sure that we build trust, we build community, so that people are able to voice their opinion. And we don't judge them, but we seek understanding, and we seek to bring them to a point where we believe they should be at, to bring about a better society.
Good point. Yeah, I think a lot of times we need to be able to have that perspective, because a lot of times it's more just reaction than it is about actually being part of something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the whole point. Identity is about bringing people together. And so I think that's the main thing we want to emphasize here, is that when we talk about being Southeast Asian, we are not excluding other people. We're just saying these are things we have in common. And so doesn't exclude any other Asian American groups.
So, Yang, before we talked about our careers, I think something that I didn't bring up that I should is just, if you're not a teacher, if you didn't do sociology, what else would you be doing? If you had a dream job, what would it be?
I don't think it's hard for me to think about a dream job, but I can imagine myself being maybe a youth organizer or a teacher. I love working with young people. I find it difficult to work with adults because it's just hard for me to be in a room with people and express my feelings. But I think with young people, I feel like I can try to relate to them, and I'm in a position where I'm forced to kind of be their role model. And so it opens me up and allows me to engage in a different manner. So I would say youth organizer or a teacher. How about you, Jason?
Well, real quick, I think I'm the opposite. I actually work better with adults than I do with children. If I had an alternate career path, I think I would be some kind of curator. Like, I feel like I would work in a museum or a library because I always like making lists and collections. People may know I have an Asian action figure collection, but I just like sorting things and putting things, categorizing things.
Well, that relates back to our topic, identity, and you are a collector. And so when you know what you like and you can label that, it helps you to give you a sense of direction for the future. So even if this career doesn't work out, you know what interests you, excites you, and so you have a future career as well.
That does it for this episode. Thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the sunshine, and see you next time.